Nearly 2 years ago, in August of 2023, I made a video on the early access release of Grimlord, a game that wasn't being subtle with what it took inspiration from. From the combat, the exploration, the collection of experience, to the boss fights, Grimlord was doing its best to be a Souls game in VR. And by my recounting, it did a good job. I was critical of the game, but I was even more excited by what this game could eventually turn into. And wouldn't you know, on December 19th, 2024, after nearly 4 years of development, Grimlord 1.0 has been released into the world. I haven't touched this game since I played through the first level or early access build in August of 2023, so I am more than ready to jump back in and measure how Metal Cat Interactive have chipped away at this piece of iron and hopefully forged it into something that's worth your time. Just be forewarned that I will be spoiling a lot in this video. I will be discussing every boss fight and location, as well as all the game's systems. But if you're on the fence, I would suggest sticking around and watching, or at the very least checking out my video on the early access version, because a lot of the complaints still stand. But first, I need to rant. So I had an HTC Vive in 2020. I've gotten so much mileage out of this thing, and it's been a darling by introducing me and chaperoning me into the world of VR. But at Christmas time this year, I got myself a Quest 3S after doing some research. I was having a great time not having a wire attached to the back of my head while playing. And I even convinced Nick to get one too, so now I have a friend to play VR co-op games with, which is so exciting. Only problem is, I couldn't record good gameplay with the Quest. For some reason, the VR view footage I record through is only recorded in like 30 frames per second. I have no idea why this is the case, but I can't watch VR gameplay that looks this choppy. Then I tried to capture the application window itself, and it had a great frame rate, but it was super cropped in and didn't have any motion smoothing like the VR view does, so everything is jittery. I had to bite the bullet and pull my old wired bitch back out to capture some half-decent footage for a while, until I eventually got a link cable to plug the Quest into the PC, and it magically made the game's application window not cropped. This is how I captured the last third of my playthrough. I really apologize for the quality of the footage on some of this playthrough though. I hate that some of it looks like it was recorded with a zoomed in camera that had Vaseline smeared on the lens. But if anything good came out of this, it's that I can tell you, if you have the option, play this game with any controller but the Vive ones. I have really come to hate these things after experiencing other VR controllers. The grips and triggers are fine, they do what they need to do, but the damn trackpads are the pits. When I'm trying to back away from enemies, I feel like the left pad just stops reading my input and stops my character. And then when I'm fighting and my right thumb happens to graze the left or right of the pads, they cause my character to snap turn 45 degrees and disorient me in the process. On top of being tethered to a computer and stepping on the cable all the damn time while fighting the bosses that we will talk about later, it just becomes aggravating and exhausting. Take it from someone who has had nearly 5 good years with this headset. Get a headset with an actual control stick and buttons. On with the show. I didn't make it a point to touch any of the story in the early access review, mainly because it wasn't finished. I mean, we only had access to the first level. There's no real narrative that could be parsed from the dialogue that was in the game at that point. But now that we have the full release, not much has changed, has it? That's not to say it isn't here, but it's Dark Souls coded. You have to put the pieces together when you get those breadcrumbs, and personally, that's not really how I get into stories. For instance, I noticed the new faces in the hub this time around, namely this goblin Peck. He's in the equipment room and is constantly barking the same voice line when you walk in there, sometimes even repeating the same one he just said.
Thundering through the towers, know that it is the roll of a little lion.
It was actually pretty annoying looking back.
Mixtures, draining their life forces.
However, as you're making your way through the second level, the spirit of one of the princes that used to live here begins to tell you about the goblins that used to serve his family, and he mentions Peck by name.
His name was an in-joke among the overseers. He was so frail that his punches felt like little birds pecking. He would have been trampled to death had I not taken him in.
I'm so sorry, Peck. I had no idea. That is a sad tidbit, but none of this ever becomes truly compelling. Wearing its inspirations on its sleeve, Grimlord doesn't have a story. It has a somewhat intriguing backdrop where you'll be told stories about how this kingdom used to survive. But now it's all gone to shit, and you have to take down the ones who did it. And at the end of the game, they ask you to be a good guy or an ambiguously selfish guy, and that's that. Roll credits. Now, of course, this is true for other Souls games as well. The story is minimal, but those games have their world. The experience of seeing these ruined locations and putting the pieces together was always fascinating from a narrative standpoint, but also from a purely artistic view as well. Walking through the hostile museum of these games' worlds is one of their greatest strengths, but in Grimlord, I'm sorry to say, I don't think they nailed this aspect either. Do you remember that joke that floated around when The Last of Us 2 released, where instead of some symbolism or vague quote being scrawled on the wall, it just read, "Everyone is dead"? There is a slight chance that I just made that up and I'm having a bit of a Mandela effect in my brain, but I would be more okay with that than the lack of really anything here in Grimlord. Looking back, it's mostly the interiors that are all lacking. They don't have any eye-catching adornments on most of the walls or hallways, very few immediately identifiable assets, just super cookie cutter. There are times when I feel like I'm walking around in one of those $5 backroom game environments waiting for a monster to jump scare me. Oh no! The environments look generic as far as Souls-like environments go. There's a bit of a benchmark when it comes to the kind of locations we see in these games. They're usually filled with dense scenery for the purpose of being nice to look at, sure, but also giving us an idea of what the tragedy that befell this place was. Grimlord, surprisingly, barely has any of this. Some of the areas are well constructed as far as level design goes, and we'll touch on that in a minute, but visually, I expected more. The art direction of these areas are decent. The first area is a nice castle town. It probably has some of the more unique layouts you'll see in this game. And by that I mean the level design isn't made up of a bunch of square rooms like a lot of the other areas. There are broken bridges with climbable surfaces and more interesting ways to gain ground than a staircase at the end of a hallway. The mines were also good. I dig the rickety walking paths, even if the tunnels look a little rough. Definitely flat due to the lack of lighting. The riverside areas were some of my favorite because of the contrast they had. The way the moon was shining down was really pretty, but the interior of the manor was getting into that uninteresting territory with its square rooms that feel like someone specifically stole all the decorations for some reason. The library area was a neat addition, but it still felt bland. And then after that, the rest of the game is mostly interiors with large square rooms where you fight some enemies with a few exceptions. Again, there were a lot of choices made that I like. The overgrowth on the outside of the castle was probably my favorite. I love the red leaves and how they give this bare exterior some much needed color. I liked the short roof section, and I liked the last area where you go underground. But all of the interiors are so boring. They made it a point to tell us that they upgraded from Unreal 4 to Unreal 5 in one of their updates. And I never expected this to completely overhaul the game's look, seeing as how it's still a small team. But there's still a lot of visual polish this game lacks. Let's start with the LOD on these textures. This is a big one, so I hope it gets fixed, but it was impressive just how many of these textures were blurry and stuck on their lowest resolution. Right when I loaded into the first area after the early access portion, I was met with a big blurry cliffside. I really can't undersell how many textures in this game have this problem. It was wild. There's also an equally frequent problem of the levels just not being put together very well, especially when exploring the interior areas. These pieces of these levels are often just not stuck together, and when I notice, it just yanks me completely out of the experience. You can't expect me to suspend my disbelief when staring at these floating ramparts. There are also plenty of techniques that I expected to be utilized that just aren't, like this light that's shining into the prison from above. It doesn't look like my weapons or character cast a shadow, but I did test this when I got back to the tutorial area and I saw that there I am casting a shadow, it's just really diffused for some reason. I can barely notice it. This also pulls me out of the experience really quickly because I feel like I'm not really there in a VR game of all things. I can't be sure on this, but there is the possibility that this game's visuals are being held back to keep the game running well on Quest platforms. I'm playing on PC though, and I expected the visuals to be more impressive if I'm being real with you, because this just doesn't cut it. Getting back into the bland nature of the levels, this bleeds into exploration, making me feel like I wasn't encouraged to explore the small spaces enough, like in the cellar area. There are these spaces between the barrels where items could have been hidden, but there's never any materials or treasure hidden in obscure places. The library I mentioned has shelves galore in there, but every single one of them are bare of not only items I can use, but books! Who stole all of the books? The catacombs where these holes are probably meant for bodies, except there are no bodies. Why are the environments so bare? I just think it's strange that exploration on a micro level isn't more rewarding in a VR game, where you can get away with hiding things in places other games couldn't get away with. Grimlord does put good treasures on dead bodies in hard to reach areas. Don't get me wrong, if you're a curious player, you can find tons of great treasures. There are so many secret pathways, most of which hold treasure chests. Only I found that these chests feel unnaturally video gamey. First of all, they clash visually and geographically. These chests look so out of place when they're put on the grass in a courtyard or something of the sort. They just stick out like a sore thumb, and it makes little to no sense for this chest to be here in the game's world. It's the middle of a courtyard, the entrance to the castle. They're fine when they're in the walls of the castle or hiding somewhere where it makes sense for a chest to be, but on the front lawn? These chests too often feel like they're the only way the level designer knew to hide meaningful items. They're the main way you find important treasures in the game, and when you open them, they always have these treasures perfectly aligned and symmetrically pleasing to the eyes. It's very convenient, but I don't think it should be. I don't know, is this nitpicking? Most likely. But where I'm going with this is that the way of discovering new treasures doesn't feel believable. Why is this armor set on a stand at the bottom of this staircase tucked away in a seemingly random part of the manor? Because that's what all of the discoverable armor sets are on, and not a one of them makes sense. I know this probably saved tons of time not making unique objects that can be interacted with for these armor sets, but can we not at least make it kind of believable? Put these stands in an armory next to the manor's ground floor. If I could have it my way, I would love to see it put on a dead body with a sparkle effect so you know you can interact with it, but I understand if that's too much to ask for. Bottom line though, the game needs way more of that type of collectible. I like that after beating a boss, you grab a special crafting component, but I also needed more instances of powerful crafting materials being hidden in engaging areas throughout the world. Opening a chest and grabbing heavy leather or a flawless source stone is great because that means I can make better weapons, but I don't really feel like I earned that weapon because all I did was open a huge treasure chest that was sitting in the middle of the level with a thoughtfully arranged assortment of items waiting for me to pick them up. There are glimmers of good environmental storytelling and believable item placement in the game at times. And those are the moments where I felt like I was actually exploring these locations. I was an adventurer fighting through these ravaged locations, using my arsenal to traverse these begotten lands. Maybe I even come across an optional boss. It's amazing when that's the game I'm playing. But more often than not, those nooks and crannies are bare as shit. And that bums me out, man. I want to get more in depth with combat later on, but I think right now, we should at least touch on it really quickly. Similar to most other aspects, I don't feel like it's seen much change since early access. I still really enjoy fighting the mob enemies. They're fun to engage with, and pinpointing their weak spots is always fun. The zombies are still great basic enemy types, and the dismemberment is still awesome to see. Knights in the early access version had the problem of getting too close to the player when performing their attacks. This led to awkward battles where your weapon would get caught on their model. But now I notice how they, along with most of the other enemies, were given a kick move. It works as a believable attack, but also a subtle way for the combat to continue its immersion by getting the player out of a situation they likely put themselves in. Yeah, so I can admit that this was my fault on occasion. They can still lunge into the player, but this kick move is a good equalizer to move the player back if they get too close. I also discovered the power of pierce damage in this run. Running up and stabbing an enemy in the head or chest was often a great means of taking care of enemies with no armor. It's the main way I took down these dark sorcerer enemies. I even discovered a secret Ultima weapon for pierce damage in the middle of my playthrough, but I'll share that with you later. The poise system is still present, with enemies collapsing to the ground after you've gifted enough blunt force trauma to the head. This causes them to ragdoll, and from there you just smack them when they're down there. I think their recovery time has been reduced across the board, so it's not as ridiculous, but honestly, I would rather have this than not. I did enjoy fighting the goblin enemies for one level. It's a shame the orcs and goblins were only present for that one area. For the rest of the game, I'm stuck fighting knights and other knights and different types of knights. It was always fun to win these one-on-one duels, but some extra enemy types would have gone a long way. I hate to keep hammering the point home, but it's what makes other Souls games worlds come alive. Seeing the other types of enemies unique to that area and how radically different they are from the encounters in the rest of the game. The caged monstrosities in the manor were a little awkward to fight, but honestly, I loved that. Because of course fighting a cage of arms and legs with a sword and shield would be awkward, but the way you're supposed to stab through the bars to kill them is so unique. It's no wonder I remember this level more than the others. Yeah, fighting a holy priest in a big church is similar, but it's also less visually unique. The moveset is different, but it's still a humanoid enemy in another square room. Again, all of the enemies are fun to fight, but the combat isn't what makes a Souls game. It's the combination of the enemies, the setting they're placed in, as well as the combat. Returning to this game was very interesting, because I remembered the layout of the first area very vividly, but I could tell that there were several things that were different. Some item placement was definitely changed from the demo. I remember getting the materials to make the great axe much earlier. I had that weapon when going through most of this section, but now I had to work for that refined steel ingot. I didn't have access to boss weapons until after beating the big spear boss. I was also able to make a great ice staff that froze undead enemies after beating the golem boss. But that's not the case anymore. The only type of upgraded magic staff I had in the first level was a deep emerald, which gave me access to stronger lightning spells. Magic seems like it's been buffed across the board. The staffs will shoot elemental projectiles of whatever flavor your current staff is. There are special runes you're supposed to draw with the staff for the spell to activate. I think fire is a circle, maybe lightning is a zigzag, but I usually just wiggled the staff around until it activated. The staff's biggest attack comes from charging the spell and then slamming the staff to the ground. For the fire staff, a wave of fire wipes out enemies in close range. A lightning staff will bring down a lightning strike, but it's weird, because I felt like it would target enemies randomly. It was hard to gauge where the strikes would actually hit. I think the strikes came down wherever I was looking, which is fine, but I couldn't be sure. I would get some insane damage off on bosses sometimes, but then I'd do the same thing and get way less impactful results. It was too inconsistent for me. Ice was still my favorite for a while. Instead of a wave of ice that freezes undead, I charged the staff, thrust it down, and a volley of icicles decimate anything standing directly in front of me. This was such a good tool for thinning any herds of enemies and making fights more fair. Magic was my go-to pack clearing tool, because I later found the other two types of magic. My favorite was shadow magic, mainly because it looked the coolest, but it also had the big burst special attack, similar to fire. I used this so often to make gank fights easier on myself. And then there was also holy magic. This staff special would suspend enemies in the air for a moment, leaving them wide open for a beating. Later in the adventure, you also have the ability to assign other special moves for your staffs. You can get a flamethrower move for your fire staff, but it kinda sucks. It doesn't spew out in front of you like a flamethrower should. It also just looks awful. It's like a fire gif was taped onto the end of the staff. Thankfully, using this thing, you can swap it back to the AoE slam move. This does also apply to the new special moves that boss weapons can use, but give me just a second to circle back around to that. One thing the demo wasn't able to properly demonstrate is how you need to constantly keep your favorite weapon types up to date with the new parts you find. You can't traditionally upgrade your weapons in Grimlord, so the only way to do increased damage aside from grinding and leveling up your stats is to reforge your weapons with new parts. And just like in the demo, this is one of my favorite aspects of this game. As you play, you'll find these recipes, usually tucked neatly into chests, but when you find them, the blacksmith will be able to craft that part into a weapon of your choosing. And one thing I do have to applaud Grimlord for is making scenarios where every weapon type is not only viable, but preferred. Of course, every enemy or boss can be beaten with whatever weapon, but I found that most situations had a weapon type that was better suited to it than others, giving me a reason to head back to the blacksmith often and change out what I was comfortable with for something else. And more often than not, have it be perfect for the new situation. I love applying my new solution to the problem and seeing it work. I think that's a rewarding thing for any RPG. It is a little disappointing that Grimlord doesn't have at least the option to see damage numbers above enemies though. While there is a diegetic way to tell if you're doing well in fights owed to the sound design, there are different effects for when you strike armor, when you're striking chainmail, and when you're hitting flesh. This does a good enough job telling you that you're doing well, but I also think having a health bar above their heads would be a nice quality of life option as well. Bosses have them, and it does a great job of telling me that my new strategy is either working really well or not at all. It tells me that striking them in that spot is good or bad. Having the option for enemy health bars or damage numbers would be so nice. And I don't want to hear that would break immersion or something like that, because if that's what you're worried about breaking immersion, buddy, grab your clipboard because we need to do a walkthrough of these castles. You already listened to feedback by letting us knock the corks off of the potion bottles with shields and weapons. It makes healing in the middle of a big fight so much easier. And the biggest change was letting us sprint by just clicking in the left stick. No more will I have to do this embarrassing shit. Yeah, health bars can only improve the player experience, by the way, because I want to see those health bars drain in a second when I whip out my busted weapons and smash the enemies. Or the ultimate weapon that I discovered on this playthrough. So I didn't find this weapon in a secret hiding spot or something like that. No, I was actually traveling with it the whole time and didn't even realize it. I was fighting a bunch of enemies here and I was scrambling to put my staff away and grab my sword, but I grabbed the wrong weapon, was feeling a little silly, and... What? Yeah, so come to find out, arrows are the most overpowered weapon for most enemies in the early game. No joke. I'm assuming that the arrows keep the damage they would do when fired from a bow when used like little jabbing sticks, but I'm not sure. All I know is that if you want to make the early game easier, make sure you have a shield as well as a quiver of arrows.
One hit, one jab from an arrow.
Hell, I say early game, but I kept a quiver of the best type of arrow I could craft with me throughout the entire game. Because not only are they still amazing poking sticks, able to one-shot late game enemies like priests because they don't wear armor on their chests, as well as finish off armored knights without effort after I knocked off their helmet, but arrows are also incredible for climbing. God, I honestly wish these walls would have been used more often. But you'll sometimes come across wood that can have tipped weapons stabbed into them, and from there you can hoist yourself up. In the beginning, I used daggers to climb, and they worked, but they also took up 2 inventory slots. Thus, when I saw how useful arrows were in combat, I wanted to see if that worth extended to climbing. And yep, it sure does. So now I have 30 arrows to climb these structures, and while climbing on these structures, I noticed something very important.
Yeah, do it. Come on. Fucking idiot, man. The AI in this game is so brain dead rock stupid, dude.
And that's how dumb the AI is in Grimlord. Seriously, guys, this is ridiculous. It's certainly very funny, but also, what the f***?
Yeah.
Some of these scenarios would have been pretty intimidating if it weren't for the enemies literally throwing themselves off of high ledges and standing there to take the damage. It makes my experience easier for sure, but it also, again, takes me out of the experience. And if you want to talk about the kings and queens of taking me out of this experience, let's finally talk about boss fights. In the early access video, I mentioned how boss fights aren't great because a lot of their attacks were difficult to dodge in a VR game. They either came out way too fast or were just too difficult to get out of the way. And unfortunately, not only are the previous bosses basically the same, but the new bosses are worse. Much worse. To the point where I think the bosses are actually the worst part of the game and will actively ruin the experience for some players. Let's go in order like last time. The tutorial boss was actually fine now that I had a shield. I could block his attacks and my attacks were actually taking a decent chunk of his health. But to kill him this time, I was actually able to smack him off a cliff for an instant kill.
Die, bitch, die! Oh my god, that worked.
This was such unintentional foreshadowing, oh my god. The golem boss was a bit better this time around after discovering that you can actually jump when he does his foot slam attack to dodge it. This information will serve me very well in the coming fights. But other than that, it was a pretty standard fight, lots of circling around him and tapping his grippers. The Black Knight gave me way more trouble here than he did in the demo. His attacks come out a bit faster and the Vive trackpad makes backing away from his attacks way more difficult. But eventually, after many deaths, I put him down.
Oh, you, dude.
Next is the final boss of the early access period, the Hollowed One, and I still don't like this guy. This is the first boss that I really don't see how the developers want this boss to be taken seriously. The other bosses, you can see the vision. The first boss is a duel with a warrior that you can block and overpower. Same with the Black Knight. And the Golem was slow enough that you could scramble around and take him out with some trial and error. I didn't love the last two, but they were manageable. But the Hollowed One is so big and wields a weapon that can't be reasonably blocked or parried. So I ask, how are you supposed to fight this guy? That's a legit question, by the way. If someone has a video of them using a sword and shield to fight this thing legitimately, I would love to be proven wrong. Because I attempted several times to fight him earnestly, but his basic attacks go through my shield and his magic attacks are absolutely devastating. I even tried to cheese him again by getting him stuck in the same place and shooting magic at him until he tips over. I even went back to Riala to completely respec into magic because you can reroll your character at any point, thank God. But unfortunately, this strategy won't work anymore thanks to the major nerfs to the health and mana regeneration talents. You don't regenerate nearly enough to make this viable. I would have had to stand there for probably a solid hour of pelting him and then waiting, so I just lost that attempt. But thankfully, on another run, I was getting walked, as he likes to do, when I looked back and noticed something.
He's stuck.
Yup, and he stayed that way. I walked closer and I even started summoning lightning on his ass, but he didn't budge. So I took advantage of the situation, smacking him and smacking him, not enough to make his poise bar fill up, that might reset him, so then I would wait for that to go back down and then repeat the process until he died. I don't care if this is cheap in your eyes. I have no patience for bosses that are clearly not designed for your character's capabilities. Again, I'd love to be proven wrong by your flawless no-hit Grimlord run, but until then, let's move on. Grub the Goblin Hero was a good boss. I like this guy. He had some cool attacks and wasn't a totally unmovable and unblockable stone wall. He was also weak to my fire staff, so I didn't feel like he was unfair. The Magister is next, and I wasn't a huge fan. Not because she was a large monster fight, I'm thankful she wasn't, but she's the typical summoner battle, where she's the target, but she's not all that intimidating on her own. So instead, the real challenge is taking down her lackeys before you challenge her. Not bad, but kinda meh.
Next time, it won't be this easy.
I want you to remember that she said that. I want you to keep that in your noggin. Anyway, next boss. The Dryad was the only time a boss was reused and given an actual health bar. Since it doesn't happen too often, I'm not that upset that it's here. It was kinda cool to fight an early game boss with my increased abilities. I'm just glad this isn't a huge issue like with Elden Ring. It is a 1-to-1 rematch against the Golem, so I beat him the exact same way with some magic help this time. I will say that this was the first boss where I used the strat of running around in a circle, staying to his back, and then just smacking them. This isn't a problem if you're using a wireless headset, but since I was using wired, I often got tangled up and would nearly trip myself up on the cables. Ooh, I can only imagine how awful the wiring inside this headset cable must look. Be careful, my fellow melee users. The cables are your true worst enemy. Next is Fiddlixia, and I'm going to apologize for the quality really quick because this was me trying to record using the Oculus Mirror app and I didn't realize how much it cropped the image. But this fight was absolutely terrible. Her attacks were almost impossible to read, therefore impossible to actually have a legitimate back and forth with. Like the other large bosses, her attacks just go through my shield at times without warning, and she is incredibly mobile. This is one of the times I was talking about when I said I had to change my playstyle to overcome a challenge. In Fiddlixia's case, this means I made the best spear I possibly could, pumped skill points into pierce damage, and turtled behind a shield for the fight while staying on top of her and thrusting that thing in front of me. It looks terrible in the footage, and I'm so sorry if you get motion sickness easily, but it got me results. And she is the only boss in the game that gets a true second phase when she reaches half health. It's pretty cool if I'm being honest. So in the level beforehand, you fight those caged creatures I was talking about. These are a result of a potion gone wrong in this kingdom that caused those who drank it to grow extra limbs. So these experiments were left for dead and now they walk the halls of the manor. But Fiddlixia is riding atop one of these monsters, and when she hits half health, she falls and starts hopping around like Yoda from the prequels. But thankfully, she also becomes far more susceptible to magic damage. I didn't really enjoy this boss, but at the very least, I beat her somewhat fair and square, so that's something. Too bad the same cannot be said for the remaining bosses. Next is the Warden, and he's not so bad. Not because he's secretly a good fight or something, no, get real. He's not as bad as most, with swings that can actually be blocked and a stomp move that can be reliably jumped over. But I didn't beat him with actual skill.
Absolutely wild. He threw his hammer over there, and now he is frozen. He does not want to move. He's almost dead, as you can see. But I guess I'm just gonna wait until this poise bar goes all the way back down. It's almost there. Just a little bit more.
I don't even know what to say at this point, honestly. But then, in the next section of gameplay, this guy gets turned into a common enemy, and they spam him everywhere. The first one was when I was walking through this tunnel and saw something twitching up on the rubble here, and I see, oh, it's an enemy. So I poke him, and now he wakes up? I couldn't help but feel like he wanted to get up before I smacked him, but maybe he got stuck? I don't know. But I took him out the same way I fought the warden before he froze. I stayed to his back and smacked him, only occasionally jumping his foot slam move. I think the legs are his weak point because after striking them a few times, he consistently staggers back, which only leads me to getting more hits on him. 16 minutes later, I fight another one who's set up just like a mini-boss, only no health bar, surprisingly. Either way, same strategy, killed him. 7 minutes after that, I find another. I use the same strat. And then no less than 3 minutes later, I find a double battle with 2 of these things. And that's not the end. There were 3 more to fight before I left the area, and 2 more before the game was over. No other mini-boss type enemy got reused like that. And I would be alright if it was fun, but the fights just aren't.
So yeah, I'm still waiting. How's everything going with you guys? Is it all good? That's good. Oh, my hand f***ed up. Okay, it's all good. Yeah, back to the video.
The next boss, Bishop Siamese, brought me to the brink of quitting altogether. He is the worst of the worst to me. Not only does he have the longest run back to his room in the game, filled with enemies that you have to not only avoid, but make sure you kill this priest before you go in, because if you don't, it can somehow shoot auto-tracking magic through the wall during the fight and kill you.
That is so f***ing stupid!
But on top of that, you have to fight 2 golden knights before the bishop enters the fight, who, by the way, have unblockable magic attacks that go right through shields. He also has ridiculous moves that cannot be blocked or parried, like his super holy laser move, which is basically a one-hit kill when it decides to hit you, because there are some instances where I guess it just takes mercy on me and leaves me alone. I guess those pre-fight prayers really paid off. Except, again, only sometimes. I was on the verge of throwing in the towel. I had the shortcut door to the already long-winded walk back close on me. I tried to pry it open with my weapons and stuff, and my anger finally paid off when I punched it to get it to swing open. I was f***ing tilted, dude, let me tell you. But then, on my last trip up this elevator, there was a recipe on the ground. Mind you, I have walked past this doorway a solid 20 times at this point, so I have no idea where this thing came from. But it's a special move for my weapons. Now, like I mentioned, similar to how the magic staffs can swap their abilities, boss weapons can have unique activatable skills too. And using that room, you can choose your favorites to enchant your weapons and create unique playstyles. That might sound like you can inject some sauce into these weapons, but in reality, most of these are really terrible. I tried to use them so many times, but they never seemed to work, or if they did, I wasn't able to tell, or the damage was just awful. This is another reason why health bars or damage numbers would be really great. To see if what you're doing is being resisted, or if it's super effective, or whatever. It's so helpful, guys, come on. But anyway, the only one that I loved, and it actually became my main method of dealing damage, was this hammer move that was given to me through what I can only explain as divine intervention. Or the game's shoddy programming, because I later discovered that this area is right above a treasure chest, and I'm assuming this recipe somehow fell through the floor and landed directly underneath where it was supposed to be. But either way, I love this hammer attack. It carried me hard through the last third of the game, and I couldn't be happier. I don't know if I would have made it without this. I completely re-rolled my character again, dumping all of my points into health, strength, and blunt damage. I crafted a hammer with a part I got for beating the warden and enchanted it with that attack and was set. Now, I do think this is another mark against the game, because just like some of the other special weapon skills, I don't think the hammer attack worked on some enemies. I tried it on Bishop Siamese and he didn't take any damage. And to jump the gun, the final boss wasn't affected by it at all either. Remember this big bitch? The one who was talking all that talk? Yeah, the hammer makes short work of her and her big ass f***ing eyes. She was honestly one of the better fights. She probably would have been pretty fun if I hadn't found such a busted ability. She begins a triple whammy of pretty much back-to-back-to-back-to-back fights that cap out the game. After the Magister is taken care of, we fight the titular Grimlord. The fight starts out really interestingly. He binds your hands in chains, and then you break them when he swings his first hit at you, and you have to block it. I was excited for this fight after that, But then, not too long after, he got stuck. Only this time, he was hard stuck, like my hits aren't doing any damage at all. I tried to walk around to see if I could fix him somehow, but no, I had to exit out and reload the game. And after that, he was a decent fight. I liked him a lot more than Fidelixia or the Bishop, but he eventually fell victim to the hammer. And right after this, we come to not what I expected the final boss to be. The Elder Race is the final encounter of the game, and I was very underwhelmed. It's the standard hit the hands boss where you break one of the accessories, they fall on the platform to take a power nap while you smack their weak point, lather, rinse, repeat. I fought more engaging hand-themed bosses in Super Mario 64. He also just falls into the category of the other large bosses where his attacks aren't fun to counter or dodge. When he screams, it's time to walk around slowly to avoid the magical falling rocks. He's got a sweep move that hits twice, and I learned that you can use the dodge to phase through them, but all of his other attacks are just moving out of the way, and then you smack his hands until he falls down. His weak spot didn't seem to take all that much of an increase in damage anyway, so it was a pretty drawn out encounter. Doubly so because my hammer attack didn't work at all. Again, I wish I knew what attacks enemies and bosses were immune to. If it's an elemental weakness, that's fine, I can use that information to tweak my loadout, but this doesn't give me anything, so I'm left feeling like it's the game bugging out again, and maybe I should just keep trying. It's the inconsistency that bothers me with most of these bosses. Inconsistency with their movesets, inconsistency with their damage, inconsistency with their programming. I never know if what I'm doing is the intended method or a total fluke. I've been holding off on direct comparisons to show you the full extent of this game's lack of polish, but now I want to show you some boss fights from a well put together VR adventure game. In Vengeful Rites, large bosses are difficult, but not because you feel like you can't back away from them or even approach them to begin with. It's because the challenge is well defined and you're given feedback when you're successful or unsuccessful. Vengeful Rites not only does large fights well, but one-on-one duels too. The battle against the vampire is intense and tests your ability to parry his sword strikes. The fight against the ogre does the same, except with a great puzzle-solving gimmick as well. It might not have the physical feedback Grimlord has, which does add a certain satisfying crunch to combat, but when the game messes up, and that's pretty often by the way, it can get very frustrating.
What the hell is happening, man?
With your camera often getting stuck inside the enemy due to how they lunge forward with their attacks. Enemies like the Bishop, the Hollowed One, and the Golems keep you at such a distance that you would need a long spear or a sword to hit them if you kept the appropriate distance to counter their attacks. But if you want to actually survive the fight, you have to play dirty. Circle strafe behind them and get close to hit them repeatedly, but that leads to your weapon or your shield getting stuck on the boss. And of course that doesn't affect the boss, but it certainly affects your ability to get away as well as attack and block incoming damage. I asked that more gimmick fights make their way into the game in the last video because those are far more memorable to me in VR than these large enemies that are nothing but wars of attrition by their purest definition. In a flat Souls game, fights like Fidelixia would be tough, so in Grimlord, where you don't have a dodge roll, where you can't reliably parry, where you can't lock onto the boss and see what they're doing while you heal, it's frustrating to deal with all of these handicaps. It's also the physicality of retrying a boss in a flat Souls game that just means you're holding the joystick forward and dodging a few times while you're snuggled up with your blankie on the couch. But in VR, I was standing through all of it, swinging through all of it, getting twisted up in my cables through all of it. Dying like a chump to a cheap one-hit kill hurts way more in VR.
Oh god. What the f***? What the f***, man?
If you're okay with all of these things, then by all means, I hope you enjoy Grimlord. But for me, I think there needs to be some major tweaks to damage values and boss hitboxes. Similar to the Knight's kick moves I mentioned before, bosses have some moves that hit the player back, but they often feel unfair because bosses are at a huge advantage when the player is far away from them. The bosses that leap backwards to reposition are preferable because the player doesn't take unfair damage. And I'm not convinced blocking those attacks is a solution with the current stamina system. Since we're in a VR game, a stamina meter can't really stop you from moving around or swinging your weapon. Instead, Metal Cat have attached the stamina meter to holding onto your weapons. If this yellow meter above your health and magic fills to the sides, you'll be susceptible to dropping your weapon or shield in the middle of the fight. And I think this is stupid. I guess this was added to give you another resource to manage during fights, but I don't think this was a good idea. In flat games, stamina is used to balance things like sprinting or climbing, things that the player shouldn't be able to do indefinitely. So to me, stamina in VR games should be literal, the stamina of the player playing the game, because if you put a limit on what the character can do, it widens the gap between the player and the game instead of shrinking it. All this does is make me pick up my shield after it's been knocked out of my hand. It's only an annoyance, not a layer of strategy like I think they think it is. And that's if it doesn't get knocked out of your hand and go flying across the room, or if it somehow falls through the floor or goes through a wall. I hope I've been able to demonstrate it already, but if you haven't picked up on why I titled this video what I did, Grimlord doesn't feel finished. It still needs lots and lots of polish. As you can see, the credits are reachable, but I couldn't go too far without something insane happening to me. The funny spasming zombie enemies have been patched out since early access, but now we have something that's not funny. Instead, it's just disruptive.
And now my arm's under the f***ing floor. Love that!
When you use a heavy weapon like I like to, your character turns into Sonic the Werehog with these stretchy limbs.
Let's do this! Ta! Huh! Ta! 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 Whoa! Ha! Whoa! Ah! Whoa!
It's kinda what kept me from using my great axe with a short handle in the beginning because I didn't feel as accurate. My weapon would get thrown out farther than I expected my arms to reach, so I wouldn't reliably hit my targets. My in-game weapon also did this, but I learned to use my wrist to bop enemies instead of fully swinging on them. Thankfully, I never fell through solid ground, but I almost quit after slipping through a piece of this rickety bridge in the mines.
No. I don't want to play this game anymore.
I had a play session come to a scary end when I heard that dreaded noise. I don't know if this one was necessarily the game's fault, but I was worried about my progress not saving since I had to just close the application through Windows. Thankfully, Grimlord seems to have a generous autosave system, so when I loaded back in, I was right where the game left me. And finally, I don't think it's a bug, but it is cheap. Twice, the game intentionally attempts to jump scare you. In the previous video, it got me. You can hear me for real scream like a little girl if you like. No, I'm not going to play the clip. But this time, I checked, and yes, the game literally spawns an enemy right behind you when you interact with this chest.
That shit's not fucking funny. I'm not falling for that shit again. Fuck you. And you just fucking stand there. Fuck you.
And then there was another one in the catacombs that I could just feel in my bones. I suppose it happening only twice isn't bad, but I still think that's a bit cheap for them to obviously just spawn in when you walk past a certain point. I think that's all I've got to say though. Listen, I had really high hopes for this 1.0 release, but I honestly just don't think it's ready. Yes, the game is content complete, technically, but as I've shown, there are a lot of bugs that need to be worked out. Collision for enemies and bosses, hitboxes on bosses specifically soured my entire play session at times. Enemy and boss AI, holy shit, this was wild. I was annoyed anytime I felt myself coming up on a boss fight. 9 times out of 10, they are nothing but annoying, damage sponge roadblocks that stop me from seeing the rest of the game. I'm not sold on the stamina system. I'm not sold on the cookie cutter feel of a lot of these locations. But I still had a lot of fun. I want to make that clear. Adventuring through the levels is great. I adore the sense of discovery that the optional paths give. The treasures themselves are rewarding, but most of them aren't exciting to come across. I want to see more of the treasures spread throughout the actual level. The game could stand to be less predictable altogether. I called ambush encounters just about every time. Lots of enemies waiting behind doorways that you can see through the crack in the wall. If there's a treasure chest awkwardly sitting on the top of a castle's roof at the end of a long stretch, keep your ears peeled for enemy footsteps because that chest ain't free. I don't know if I can recommend this game at the moment because of how unfinished it obviously is. But if you're a huge fan of Dark Souls and want a VR experience that harkens back to the first entry as far as exploration goes, but the second entry as far as boss fights go, then Grimlord might be for you. I'm still going to be keeping an eye on it because of their roadmap they released. More story content and eventually multiplayer. If there's one thing I think would make this whole experience more palatable, it's doing it with one or more friends. This game as a co-op experience would be awesome. It would take pressure off of the single player, it would increase the damage done to bosses. I would be really interested to see that. But until then, I've rambled enough about this VR Souls-like. I hope I've shown you enough to make a decision on whether or not you should play it. I don't think I have a solid enough opinion to tell you a definitive yes or no, so all I can tell you is approach at your own risk. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. I hope I could show you a good unbiased view of Grimlord. Next time, I think that I'm going to be trying something a little different. Steam Next Fest is upon us and is hopefully going on by the time this video is uploaded. And I've been wanting to do this for a while, where I take a bunch of the demos from Steam Next Fest and I play them by myself or with a couple of friends, and then I make a big compilation video with all the videos from the Next Fest, the demos that I played, and show all of you. I'm very excited to do that one and show you guys all some fantastic demos. After that video, we are jumping into Dragon Quest with the first game. Busy. If you want to stay up to date with me and everything I do here, be sure to check out the description for the links to the Discord where we discuss anything and everything, as well as the Patreon where I release ad-free and uncensored version of my videos, as well as bonus videos. You can join my $10 supporter White Ghost 117 and get access to all of these perks and much more. But anyway, I appreciate you for watching, so thanks for stopping by and have a great day.